Support for Here and Now and the following message come from Geico. Do you own or rent your home? Fortunately, Geico makes it easy to bundle your home and car insurance. It's a good thing, too, because having a home is hard work. Go to geico.com, get a quote, and see how much you could save.
From NPR and WBUR, I'm Scott Tong in Washington, D.C.
I'm Jane Clayson in Boston. It's Here and Now. Orange County, California is now under a state of emergency, and officials have opened a criminal investigation after one of the largest oil spills in recent state history reported over the weekend. More than 120,000 gallons of oil have leaked into the water from a pipeline that officials say is now shut down. Wildlife rescue teams are now assessing the ecological damage, including birds and fish washed ashore, slicked in oil. Let's bring in Debbie McGuire. She's directing efforts at the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center there in Huntington Beach. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning.
You've walked the beach since this oil spill. Tell us what you see. What does it look like? What does it smell like?
I actually was watching the air show on Saturday when the oil spill hit, and I thought that there was a heavy smell of, I thought, kerosene or something from the jets, and that I'd never smelled before. And then the very next morning, when I was driving into work, the heavy smell of petroleum, I could even smell it on my porch, and I live about 3 miles inland. And as I drove over the bridge and saw Talbot Marsh boomed up but pretty full of oil and birds on the shoreline, I just had that horrible sinking feeling of, oh my goodness, this could end up being really bad.
And so what's the process of collecting these oiled birds and trying to save them?
Yeah, so when they first come in, they get a full assessment by the veterinary team to see what their overall health is, because sometimes they could have other secondary injuries. So we check out their body temperature, which is in a bird 104 degrees is their average temperature. So they usually come in hypothermic because the oil breaks down the integrity of the feathers and allows the cold water to hit their skin. Once they're stable, then we prepare them for the wash. And we do use Dawn dishwashing detergent, just like everyone has read. Once they've gone through the wash and they're rinsed, we have to recondition them so that their waterproofing comes back. Because think of their feathers as a little wetsuit, and they have a uripesial gland near their tail that has a waxy substance in it. Sometimes you'll see birds kind of rubbing their head back there. They're actually getting that material to preen through the rest of their body on their feathers to make that waterproofing.
And what other marine life is at risk here, Debbie, and plant life, larger mammals included? How long will it all take to assess?
We're still assessing. It's still working it out right now. We have teams already out at sunrise. We also have sea lions, harbor seals. We do have some sea turtles out there. There's a lot of sensitive plants in the wetlands that are at risk.
You've worked on oil spill rescues for many years, since 1990, I gather. Do you see patterns here?
Each spill is different. The very first spill I ever worked was the American Trader oil spill. That was a tanker that ran over her anchor, like you said, in February of 1990, right in Huntington Beach. So I'm having a little bit of PTSD. That was 400,000 gallons spilled, a lot, 4 times bigger than what we have right now. But still, this is a very major spill. And it's just heart-wrenching for anyone that goes and sees an oil-soaked bird on the beach. It kind of hits you right deep in the soul that they're just so helpless out there, and we have to help them.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the risk of these undersea pipelines. Of course, we depend on them, and yet we know the risks and also the urgent climate conversations that are going on. What do you see here?
Well, I've always not been a fan of offshore drilling, and this is exactly why. I don't know what the cause is. They're all still trying to determine what happened, but it happened. And there's a lot of, we have, I believe, 5 of those rigs just off our coast, and there's quite a few more all the way up to Santa Barbara. If you look off our coast, it's just, to me, it's always been a disaster waiting to happen.
That was Debbie McGuire, director of the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center in Huntington Beach. Hard at work today. Debbie, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Have a good day.
Offshore accounts, as you know, are secret havens for companies and rich people to stash their cash, often avoiding taxes or rules. Switzerland comes to mind, Cayman Islands, but also, and pay attention here, South Dakota. The state's role in managing money for moguls is revealed in the Pandora Papers, a leaked trove of some 12 million documents. And for more, let's go to Robin Farzad. He's host of Public Radio's Full Disclosure. And Robin, as far as disclosure, I gather you don't have millions in a secret trust? I guess you wouldn't have to tell me.
Well, being a child of Miami, I prefer to launder my money in my hometown. So that's neither here nor there.
There you go. Let's talk about these accounts, these trusts. What do we know from this reporting about who has put their money in them?
This is a mass uncovering of a who's who of the wealthy across the planet, Scott, availing themselves of tax havens and other esoteric strategies to hide and protect wealth. From taxes, press scrutiny, expropriation, you name it. They are across the board and don't fit a one-size-fits-all profile. I mean, former heads of state, including former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair is implicated. The King of Jordan owns many mansions in the United States. Of course, Russian oligarchs, Nigerians. Ecuador's recently elected president reportedly transferred millions into a trust. There's the controversial former head of a Dominican sugar company who's been accused of human rights abuses. He has a $14 million trust set up for his 4 daughters. There's a Brazilian orange juice mogul who settled with U.S. and Brazilian regulators. So it's truly multi-chromatic and across the board.
Yeah. And these trusts, help me understand them a little bit. We're not talking about a living trust that many of us put in our estate plans, right? These are top secret financial products?
Yeah, these are really the province of the wealthy. It's not like you can walk into a B of A or Wells Fargo and just set up an everyday, secretive trust in South Dakota or the Caymans. The point is it's legal, and the opacity is the selling point. A trust structures a complex web among parties. There's the grantor, contributes assets, the trustee manages the trust, the beneficiary gets income from it. Each of these 3 parties can then point to the others, kind of like that Spider-Man meme, when the control is questioned. So another selling point is being able to game the types and value of assets you put into the trust, the better to cut their taxable value. Over decades and even centuries, this kind of structure can really, really goose returns and, amounts that are bequeathed from family to family.
So South Dakota, I read that it holds assets in this kind of structure of about $360 billion. That's about what Amazon makes in a year. How'd that happen in South Dakota?
Who'd have thunk, right? I mean, then again, South Dakota is famously averse to taxes. It sports no income tax, no inheritance tax, no capital gains tax. Decades ago, in the early 80s, under Governor Wild Bill Janklow, and spurred by financial special interests, South Dakota decided to become especially lax with respect to the lifespan of a trust before a trust has to distribute assets. I know that's a little inside baseball, but if you don't have to distribute assets and you add to this more secrecy than in other, say, coastal jurisdictions, boom, suddenly South Dakota totes nearly $400 billion in trust assets. And so if you set up a South Dakota trust and it could live on and on, generation after generation, it could compound fiendishly in value with comparatively little garnished in taxes. I mean, versus the rest of us having to make a traditional taxable gift to our children and grandchildren.
Now, these trust laws don't only exist in South Dakota. Several other states have them. But how are these trusts different from the laws of Delaware? We've known for years about Delaware being its own stealthy haven for clients.
Delaware is decidedly corporation-centric, much more than individuals. And other states have certainly tried to ape South Dakota. There's been no shortage of ink on Florida and Texas. I mean, the condo canyons of South Florida and, the brother-in-law of a former Nicaraguan dictator or something. But what is becoming clear now is that South Dakota is the most lenient, the most secretive, the most unabashed, even allowing you, the grantor of a trust, to be its beneficiary as well. Plus, these extraordinary protections from creditors of any kind. And so a state that's otherwise not making a lot more news economically is front and center in the wealth management business.
And just stepping back finally, this has become big business in the U.S., hasn't it, as far as the numbers? I looked at one financial secrecy index, and it ranks the U.S. second in the world, just below the Cayman Islands, just above Switzerland. Or number two.
That blows the mind that we're number 2 in this. But money, look, it's going to flow to shelters through loopholes, through trusts, through shell companies, and it's whack-a-mole. If Panama and Switzerland and Miami are being scrutinized, there's no shortage of very well-paid attorneys, CPAs, and wealth managers that are going to find a better venue for the time being. And South Dakota has been unabashed about it. And yes, it is counter to your instinct to avoid the U.S., which is home to the U.S. Treasury, IRS, and DEA, but there's also this residual rugged individualism here and a glorification of avoiding taxes. The world now has nearly 2,800 billionaires, and all sorts of bankers and attorneys and investors want to get their mitts on some of these golden crumbs. And so it's always a treacherous zone between the letter and the spirit of legality, whether you're talking about federal law or state law.
All right, Robin Farzad, host of Public Radio's Full Disclosure. Robin, thanks as always.
Thank you, Scott.
How do we deal with risk of war, of disease, of climate change, and how do we respond to it? Well, the quick answer seems to be not very well. According to a man who spent a career navigating military risk, retired General Stanley McChrystal. McChrystal commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, and we'll talk about that as well as his new book, Risk, a User's Guide. He co-wrote it with Anna Butrico. General McChrystal, welcome to Here and Now.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Now, this book goes into a lot of tragedies where the risks were somewhat known beforehand. You write about the pandemic, about 9/11, about Pearl Harbor, and yet so many times governments, businesses, organizations didn't respond to risk well. Is that part of why you wrote this book?
It's exactly why I wrote the book. I went through a lifetime of people focusing on external threats or risks, but then not responding well. And I came to the conclusion that the greatest risk to us is actually us.
Yeah, and you write about that a lot. I mean, you go into a lot of factors in the book, ingredients there, and we can't get into all of them. But yes, you say the greatest risk is to us. So that is focusing not just on the risk kind of out there, but how we in here kind of understand and respond to it. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's exactly right. If we think of risk or threats as things that are external and we can't do much about it, but sometimes we try to build Maginot lines or do other things, we often forget that we have the opportunity, in fact, I would argue the responsibility to make our organizations better prepared to deal with risk. You mentioned that we cover COVID-19 in the book, and it's almost a perfect proof case that, in fact, a threat that was coming that was knowable, and in fact, it was inevitable because pandemics do come so often and we have a good body of public health knowledge, we didn't respond too well. And that was our fault, not the strength of the threat.
And for leaders out there who are leading military organizations, businesses, families, sports teams, you argue for managing risk the way the human body does. Tell me briefly about what you mean.
That's exactly right. When we started thinking about risk, we realized it's very much like the human immune system. Now, you and I have a miracle in our bodies. Every day we are assaulted by an estimated 10,000 pathogens that could harm us or kill us. But we don't get up in the morning worrying about it because it just happens. Unless we get autoimmune deficiency or something else that weakens our ability to fight off risks. So on a constant basis, our body detects threats, assesses them as to whether they're dangerous to us, responds, defeats, destroys them, and then learns from it so it's better next time. In reality, organizations or societies writ large have the same thing, and it's a risk immune system. And so it detects, assesses, responds, and learns from that. But when it doesn't work well, when we are unable to do basics like communication, or if we don't have a diverse set of perspectives so we get a clear picture, what we've done is we've increased our vulnerabilities. We really can't do much about the specifics of threats, but we have tremendous control over those vulnerabilities. And there's some very straightforward things that an organization can do to strengthen itself, even when it doesn't have perfect clarity on what threats it'll have to face.
You mentioned having a diverse set of opinions in the room, and I just want to share one anecdote I had reporting 10 years ago in Japan after the tsunami. At the time, one management expert in Japan said, I see the same thing with the tsunami flooding this nuclear plant and the 2008 financial crisis and the Enron crisis, same movie. And he said the issue is insular cultures, right, that are not welcome to uncomfortable questions. Does that kind of get to your point here?
It does. In the book, we discuss the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961, and the new President Kennedy inherits a task to invade Cuba with some expatriates. It's not a good idea, and it's not a very good plan. But the insular culture that was created at the beginning of his administration caused it to be executed with disastrous results. And interesting, they studied it afterward, and a man named Irving Janis came up with the term groupthink, which we all use all the time now. And then you go even 18 months later for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and suddenly President Kennedy has a much more diverse set of perspectives. He opens the aperture, he gets more options, and they get a much better outcome.
So I guess as far as risks and outcomes, I want to ask about Afghanistan, where you, of course, were the top commander in 2009 and 2010. And you write about the inertia of action, military action, begetting more action. And your example is night raids in Iraq and Afghanistan that in the end offended many Afghans because they violated cultural norms. So it seems that in this effort to reduce daylight risk, it created another one and helped undermine the U.S. mission, perhaps. In retrospect, were there a lot of unforeseen risks in real time?
There were, and I would argue that we created many of those risks. We were thinking fairly narrowly, doing operations with tactics that had worked before, had been very effective in Iraq, and were comfortable to us. And so as we go to do that which is familiar to us, we were creating resistance from the Afghan people. First resentment, and then increased resistance. And so what we might get benefit tactically in capturing or killing one or two Taliban leaders was lost in the greater picture because we're making the problem worse.
Yeah. Well, I also want to ask you about Afghanistan in the context of narrative, which you write a lot about. U.S. military and government leaders for 2 decades, right, time and time again, delivered a hopeful narrative in public. We're winning, we're turning the corner. Yet privately, a lot of the messages were just the opposite, as the Afghanistan Papers book documents. And I want to ask you, as far as risks, did U.S. leaders get trapped in a narrative that kind of hid the real risks that were known?
Well, I'll push back a little on that because I was involved, and most of the reporting that I saw, both internally and some of it externally. Now, I would tell you, though, when you give people a task, they have to buy into that task and they have to become optimistic. We follow leaders who are optimistic. If a coach says we can win, we're much more apt to win because we follow him, we believe, and whatnot. I think it's a bit misleading to say that there was deception or stupidity in that. I think in many cases, people saw the situation as they hoped it would be. We want to believe that we're making progress, and we're trying to encourage people that progress can be made. So it doesn't make it not a problem, but I want to make sure that we don't buy into this idea that there was this big deception, because I didn't see that. But what I would say is it does open up the risk. And the risk is the challenge of communication, because we tell a story in the book about the Iran rescue mission in 1980. And the people tasked to do the mission go and tell the president there's an 85% chance of success. And I believe they did that absolutely believing that there was an 85% chance of success.
Right, you write that each of the 9 or 10 steps each had an 85% chance of success, but that wasn't the whole picture, right?
That's right, because probability is 0.9 times 0.9 in that case. And so when we think about our ability to communicate risk, if somebody comes and says, well, how risky is this? And you look at them and you say, it's high risk. High may mean something to you, but it may be very differently defined by that person who's hearing it. And so because much risk defies being perfectly quantified. Our challenge in trying to communicate risk clearly is something that we have to take into account as we make decisions.
Okay, finally, just coming back to your book on risk, if I can, for a moment, just gently challenge the premise here. Your book is called Risk: A User's Guide. But when it comes to giant organizations, and you advise some of them, multinational companies, governments, militaries, made up of a lot of people with conflicting incentives and short-term incentives, can these institutions really make these rational decisions about risk the way you're prescribing, or is there too much inertia in the way? You know, what's the reality here?
You know, it's a great point. It is hard. And so I would tell you, the first thing they have to do is admit that it is hard and admit that you've got all the different forces and complexities at work so that you don't oversimplify or get yourself overconfident. But the answer is, I think they can do much better than they do, because I think they can make very intentional efforts to cross-level information, to bring as many different perspectives into the problem, to understand the forces, whether it's a structure that creates bureaucracy, or whether it's a culture that creates inertia, or whether it's weak leadership. If you look hard at those, you can identify places where there's room for improvement. I think it's really hard to try to make an organization that's got a perfect immune system like we hope our human immune system is. But I think we can make it a lot better than it is. And of course, any incremental improvements can have huge effect on the effectiveness of the organization.
Retired General Stanley McChrystal's new book is called Risk: A User's Guide. He's the co-author. We'll have an excerpt at hereandnow.org. And General, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I appreciate it.
There are millions of books out there just waiting for you. But how to keep up? Introducing NPR's Book of the Day. Every weekday, we feature some of our favorite conversations with authors and writers about their latest books. You can check it out in about the time it takes to walk the dog. Happy reading.
Any day now, California Governor Gavin Newsom could sign or veto a unique bill, the first of its kind in the country. The legislation aims to diversify California's arts and culture workforce and provide jobs that pay a living wage. Chloe Veltman of member station KQED reports.
California's creative sector contributes well over $200 billion, or a quarter of the country's entire creative economy. But the devastating impact of COVID-19 on the cultural industries has made this new legislation a matter of urgency, says California State Senator Susan Rubio, who represents the San Gabriel Valley. She co-authored the bill.
To encourage people that want to go into the creative arts to explore the opportunity, but also be able to support those artists that are currently unemployed and provide a pathway to sustainable jobs.
Usha Srinivasan is the founder and CEO of Mosaic America, a small community arts nonprofit in Silicon Valley that relies mostly on volunteers. She welcomes the legislation, which would set up grant programs that arts employers like Mosaic could use to hire people.
So what that potentially could do is help organizations like ours that would love to have people that we are able to pay and we can train.
The bill was inspired by historic initiatives like the Federal Art Project, run by the Works Progress Administration, a program born of President Roosevelt's New Deal. It successfully put thousands of artists to work during the Great Depression.
Some of this work is done on canvas, but much of it is created on the walls of our schools, libraries, and other public buildings in the form of mural painting.
But advocates say the bill isn't just about growing the cultural workforce, it's about making it more diverse. The legislation would earmark grants for creative sector employers to offer paid apprenticeships to Californians who might otherwise feel excluded from pursuing arts and culture careers because of financial or other constraints. This aspect really speaks to Stephen Ruby.
It's hard for us to find diversity, and especially in our hiring, because so many of the experienced people in the area are the wider demographic that's predominant.
Ruby co-owns Merit Ceramics, a pottery studio in Oakland. He says the earn and learn part of the legislation could be a game changer. His business already saw modest gains from participating in a program in 2019 that enabled it to provide a handful of short-term paid apprenticeships to local low-income high schoolers. Ruby says he ended up offering one talented trainee a proper job.
Having more opportunity for that would certainly open the door, I would think, for enabling more people to enter this kind of field or enter this kind of community even.
But Ruby isn't clear on how the new bill will be funded, or if his for-profit business would even be eligible to receive grants.
It still seems vague.
The bill won near unanimous support in the state legislature. But the few lawmakers who oppose the bill share Ruby's concerns. State Senator Patricia Bates sent us a written statement saying, quote, "It does not specifically address who is eligible for the program, where the money will come from, and how that money will exactly be used." But bill co-author Susan Rubio says the legislation sets up the framework, and that's a crucial first step.
The funding, of course, is a concern, but I think before the funding comes, we need to establish the program.
Rubio says if the governor signs the bill into law, the state's Arts Council and Workforce Development Board will create guidelines for the program, and only then will advocates push for funding from the state budget. The governor has until October 10th to sign or veto the bill. For Here and Now, I'm Chloe Veltman.
We've been pondering this question, and perhaps you have as well. Does your job define you?
My job definitely defines who I am. That's how people see me.
I think that in many circles it does define who you are.
That's what Ruthie Woodring of Northampton, Massachusetts, and Ty Harrell of Raleigh, North Carolina told us. Our next guest would like you to think differently about how much your job dictates who you are. Joining us now is Arthur Brooks. He's a contributing writer for The Atlantic and recently wrote a piece titled, "A Profession is Not a Personality." It's part of his weekly column, How to Build a Life. Arthur, welcome to Here and Now.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
You say that Americans tend to glorify being driven and ambitious. And these days, letting work take over your life is easier than ever. What's the case you're building here for bringing balance?
It's a happiness case. And it's extraordinary to me how many people have defined themselves with their work, and they get into their 40s and 50s and they realize that they've not been fully alive. And the reason for that is that work is important for a happy life. But relationships for which we're not compensated are a lot more important. And so if you're basically a human that's defined by work, if you objectify yourself with respect to your job, you're frankly going to miss most of the important things that can make you happy.
In fact, you say striving for success at work and expecting both satisfaction and happiness, we're setting ourselves up for, quote, joyless accomplishment and unreachable goals followed by the tragedy of inevitable decline. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, what I find, and most people know this sort of intuitively, but it's really, really clear in the research, is that people who are, particularly those who are good at their jobs, they get rewarded for it, and you do more of what you're incentivized to do. And when people pat you on the back and say, great job, and give you a bunch of worldly rewards like money and promotions on the basis of it, you're going to do it more and more and more. And then increasingly, you start to look at each additional hour in your life, and you kind of work on what economists call marginal thinking, which is this hour, what's its highest and best use? And it's very easy for the 14th hour to be spent at work as opposed to the first hour at home. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I find for people who are real workaholics and addicted to success is that they don't have any real friendships. You could say that they have a lot of deal friends, but no real friends.
And so you pose these questions that you suggest we ask ourselves. Is your job the biggest part of your identity? Are you sacrificing love relationships for work? Do you have trouble imagining being happy if you were to lose your job? So those are some examples of some questions to ask. And what if the answer is yes?
Well, then it's time to reassess. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take satisfaction in our jobs, but your faith and your family and your friendships, these are things that we just can't neglect. And no time is the wrong time to actually start focusing on the love relationships that we can and should see in our lives and that we all deserve.
And at the same time, we live in a time of high costs for housing, for healthcare, for education. And economists have found that many Americans are working more than in years past. And for so many, it's not really a choice. It's an economic necessity.
Yeah, but the attitude that we have about how we see ourselves really is our choice. And what I find is that a lot of people, they have to work hard because they have to pay the rent for sure, but they still don't define themselves as a work machine. They don't get their entire sense of self-worth from that. The point of your work is to serve other people and to serve your relationships and to be a complement to the love that's actually in your life. And when it's crowding out the love in your life and when it's how you understand yourself, that's a big problem. That's actually a recipe for dissatisfaction, even misery.
How should we reshape our relationship with our jobs and our identity?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to do this. And one of the things that I always recommend is that people keep Sabbath a little bit. And I don't mean that in a religious context. That's up to every one of our listeners to decide. But the point is to make rest and completely away from work sacred, to take it really seriously. So it's like, okay, I guess I won't go into the office on Sundays, but I'm going to check my email all day long. And I'm going to start at 5 a.m. and go till 11. You're just at the office. You need time away where you're specifically away and engaged in other things. That's important. The other thing is to make sure that you do have real friends and not just deal friends. People who don't treat you as an economic tool or see you only as somebody who's incredibly good at their job. And finally, if you want to go big, this is what I do, is I take my own career completely down to the studs every 10 years and start over.
What about people for whom reinventing themselves is really not an option? They're working 3 jobs to make ends meet. Maybe you're on a work visa. You're completely dependent on your job. I mean, those people must define themselves differently than some others.
Well, it's true. And so there's a lot of privilege attached to being able to change your careers. Although I know lots and lots of people who are not in upper middle income categories who are able to get new skills and do new things pretty frequently so that they can be fortified by learning new things without being completely identified with it. And quite frankly, some of the people who have the best relationship with their work are people who are working hard, they're supporting their families, but they're working hard to support their families and to create value and come home from work and they're home from work. And they have an extremely healthy relationship with their jobs.
You've mentioned your history, and I'm seeing here that before you joined Harvard, you spent a decade as president of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative-leaning think tank in Washington. Many conservatives have pushed back against the idea of raising the minimum wage, making college affordable, expanding health care access. And I'm curious, as I'm listening to this conversation, wouldn't expanding the social safety net make it easier for people to work less and define themselves less by their jobs?
It could, and I think that the social safety net is truly the greatest achievement of the free enterprise system. But I think that there's a lot of ways that we can work together where iron can sharpen iron between the preference that a lot of progressives have for people at the margins of society and the way that a lot of conservatives think about an entrepreneurial economy. These shouldn't be incompatibilities. On the contrary, I've tried to dedicate a lot of my career to finding compromise and interesting solutions from both sides.
Let's listen now to Peggy Wren. She's a listener from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She tells us that she spent a better part of her career as a journalist in New York. She changed careers working for a startup, and then she moved to Lancaster, and she was laid off at the beginning of the pandemic. Here's Penny.
I feel like I'm a walking dead person because I have always identified myself by my job. I've been unemployed for so long, and I was also kind of leaning into my identity as a caretaker for my elderly father, and he just passed away. So now I'm left without an identity, and I really don't know where to start. I'm at a loss now.
So what advice do you have for people like Penny who are out of the workforce, struggling to figure out what their identity actually is? They don't have a job.
It's really tough because so many people have kind of been all in on their careers for so long. And the truth is, we're all going to be in that situation sooner or later because there's decline that comes in every career. And so we have to think about this in advance. So my guess is that what she will do, I hope that what she does, and the advice that I would give her and advice I would give myself and you and all of us, is to be investing in those other accounts of your faith, something that gives you a big philosophical adventure, your family relationships, the ties that bind that shouldn't ever break, especially, by the way, for political reasons. And then the friendship, which are the most intimate relationships that we have in our lives. And these are the ties that we choose. And focusing on those gives an entirely new sense of the answer to the question, who am I?
I think about public defenders or community organizers or artists or doctors or individuals who express their passion and seek purpose through their careers. Isn't there some benefit to caring deeply about your career and defining yourself by it?
It's important to care deeply about your career because each of us has the opportunity to answer the question, why do I do what I do? I mean, the problem is actually that that's not the question that we ask when we're obsessed with our careers and we objectify ourselves. That's the what do you do question. So people, whenever you're in a conversation with a new person and you're looking for an opportunity to talk about your work or state your job title, then something exogenous has become too central to your identity. The key thing that's most important is the why. Why do you do what you do? And if you find as a public defender or as an activist or advocate, if you're dedicated to the why of lifting people up and bringing them together, then there's a million ways that you can do it. You can do it professionally, you can do it non-professionally, you can do it at the micro level, you can do it at the macro level. And that through line in your life should be why, not what.
Arthur Brooks is a contributing writer for The Atlantic. He's also a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School. We'll link you to his piece at hereandnow.org. He's also the host of The Atlantic's podcast, How to Build a Happy Life. Out with a new episode today. Arthur, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You may have heard of a new kind of artificial intelligence that generates language. Yeah, this technology can learn to write news articles and screenplays, answer questions, compose emails. It's called GPT-3, and the San Francisco company OpenAI revealed it last year. But as Eliza Strickland from IEEE Spectrum reports, this technology has a tendency to produce toxic language.
Listen to the beginning of this screenplay, titled Harry Potter, Private Eye.
Scene: a small dingy office, early morning. Furniture of the Salvation Army store variety. Sordid atmosphere. Harry Potter in ratty tweed suit, unpressed shirt, and unshined shoes sits behind the desk looking haggard, rumpled, and embittered.
That text was written by GPT-3, an AI system that can imitate human language in all its subtleties. It generated the script based on a simple prompt asking it to produce a hard-boiled detective story starring Harry Potter. GPT-3 was trained on a massive corpus of text that included most of the internet, from databases of online novels to political discussions on Reddit. From all that text, it learned rules about which words often go together in different contexts. So, when given a prompt, it continues the text with whatever words it deems suitable. Here is GPT-3's version of a pop song about Harry Potter in the style of Taylor Swift.
Harry's got glasses. He's got those bright green eyes. Girls are always screaming, 'cause he's got that Potter hair.
Businesses are clamoring to use GPT-3. It could power customer service chatbots, generate dialogue in video games, help people write emails and memos, and much more. But OpenAI, the San Francisco-based research lab that created GPT-3, hasn't released it to the public. Santini Agarwal, a policy researcher at OpenAI, explains they're worried about what it might say to unsuspecting humans who interact with it.
The thing with GPT-3 is it's so powerful because of how general it is and how it can do a whole range of tasks. But what that also means is that the risk domain is also possibly quite large and in some ways hard to predict.
So OpenAI created a private beta test where companies can apply for access to GPT-3 and can try it out only under OpenAI's supervision. The biggest concern is that GPT-3 has picked up plenty of nasty language and ideas from its internet diet. When generating text, it can spew out toxic language that reinforces society's worst stereotypes. Stanford University researchers recently gave GPT-3 the simple prompt, "Two Muslims walked into." They asked it to complete that sentence 100 times over. In 66 of those completions, GPT-3 finished the sentence with words about violence and terrorism in language so disturbing, we chose not to air it. Its language was a sad reflection of what it had learned from the internet. Here's James Zoe. He led that research and says the experiment showed the need to look under the hood of these large language models.
Because these large AI systems, these large language models, are becoming much more widely used, right? So for example, they could be behind your phone, your Siri or Alexa at home. And to the extent that they contain these negative stereotypes, that could really be propagated in all of their downstream applications, which millions of consumers interact in their day-to-day basis.
Agarwal of OpenAI won't say how many companies are trying out GPT-3 in the private beta, but she says many have already made commercial products that incorporate it.
Over 300 apps are being powered by GPT-3 right now, and that includes things like search, conversation, text completion.
OpenAI monitors how GPT-3 is being used in those apps and offers content filters to reduce objectionable language. But Agarwal says OpenAI isn't ready to release GPT-3 to the public.
As of now, we basically have no plans of having it be available generally anytime soon. Right now, through the private beta, we're very carefully seeing how the model behaves in the real world.
Some researchers think OpenAI is advancing too quickly. One of the leading voices is Margaret Mitchell, who until recently led Google's efforts on ethical AI. Mitchell says one area to explore is the creation of curated data sets for training language models.
For example, responsible dataset construction, which looks at defining inputs in terms of what you really want this model to be reflecting, rather than whatever you get and we'll see how it goes. We can be a lot more intentional on what we're trying to do.
One of Mitchell's frequent collaborators, Emily Binder of the University of Washington, says it's important to remember that large language models like GPT-3 operate purely on statistics and probability. GPT-3 doesn't have any understanding of the words it's generating, or why some language it comes up with is problematic.
Being able to produce seemingly coherent language on a broad variety of topics is a much easier problem than being able to actually build a system that understands something about all of those topics. A much, much harder problem.
Meaning that building a language model that understands language is a job that may keep AI researchers very busy. For Here and Now, I'm Eliza Strickland.
Here and Now is a production of NPR and WBUR. I'm Scott Tong in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Jane Clayson in Boston. It's Here and Now.
This message comes from NPR sponsor American Express Business, who offers a line of cards to help take your business further. Because with needs like yours, you need a card built for business. By American Express. Don't do business without it. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/businesscards.
What does it take to start something from nothing? And what does it take to actually build it? I'm Guy Raz. Every week on How I Built This, I speak with founders behind some of the most inspiring companies in the world. NPR's How I Built This? Listen now.